This lesson is on connecting to MySQL from a PHP program and then selecting some information out and displaying it on the window. So I have a program up here that I've written, and I've pre-pasted the URL up here, and I'm going to hit the Enter key to run it. So voila! This is the program that connects to a database and gives us some data of the authors who live in California. Let's go look at the code. Here we go. So I initiated this program right from the address bar. So let's go down. And this is the basics of how you make a connection to both MySQL and a particular database. There is a function called MySQL_connect. Now you pass it the server name, which is localhost in this case, the user ID, and the password. Usually a user ID and password will be more sophisticated than root and blank for a real user on a database. But for the way we're running off of WAMP or MAMP, this will be fine. So what it does is it runs this function using this login information, and it returns a pointer, if you will, a database connection to our connection. And this has to be good. If it's bad, we get unable to connect to the database. And here's how we ask if it's bad. If it's not $DB, if we didn't get a good connection, then print out some kind of message that tells you it didn't work. Now, the database name is just test. I showed you that on PHP MyAdmin. I guess we can go back there if we can find that quickly. Here. PHP MyAdmin shows us our database. And we're using the book pub database here, for example, in the class. It brings up the various databases that are here, and one of them is called test. So I clicked on that, and we have those 4 tables we've been dealing with in the previous chapters. Authors, books, so forth. Author is what we're selecting from right now. Let's go back to the code. Now, so we connect to the test database, and we use the select_db, really the MySQL select_db. And we pass it the DB name, which I set up here. And it returns also the success or failure Boolean that lets us know whether we then we put out a message that says we were unable to select our current database. We might have gotten connected to MySQL, but we didn't get connected to the particular database that we passed in this string over here. So let's move on. We didn't get any of those messages, so that's good. So now we can begin to set up a statement, a SQL statement of some kind. And I'm just going to do a select statement here so we can see some results. Now, here's a little technique that I use, and I've seen many people use, is I build the select statement in such a way that it looks almost the way I would type it in interactively. I see select last name, first name, state, from author on the next line, where state. You can see what's going on really well. In truth, PHP and MySQL don't care about that. It's one big long string, but that's very hard to read if you just stick it in a variable that way. So to get this sort of look like a regular select statement that you would type in interactively, build it up like this. Have a variable, I called it SQL statement, and I build the first part of it there, and then I use the concatenation with a dot equals to add to it each time. This is much easier to debug as we go along. Now this is a very, very simple SQL statement. We're going to do some things a little bit more complicated where we have to pass data that could change, data that the user might enter. Now look over here. It says where state equals California. Notice I've got the single ticks around it. That's what I would have to type in interactively, so that has to be a part of the string. And later on, when we start passing in a variable there instead of a literal value, we've got to make sure to include those single ticks around it in the output string of SQL, or it won't work. Now, once we have that statement formatted, we issue a MySQL_query function, and we pass to it the statement that we built in the lines above. It will return a result. Usually, if the result is good, this is going to be a special data structure that we can go through and get our grid-like information. Recall that SQL stores information in tables, which is always grid-like, but also all the results from a SQL statement come back in a grid-like fashion, very much like a spreadsheet. So I'm initializing some variables here, and now I ask the question, if not $result, means something didn't go right. If it didn't go right, I'm going to write out these errors. I'm using these functions, MySQL error, number, and the error statement. I reprint out the statement that we put in there, and the number of rows that may have been affected by the statement. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this is one way to do MySQL queries in PHP. There's another method which is called MySQL I error and MySQL I, and over here it'll be MySQL I query, and it takes slightly different parameters. You can read about that at php.net and read about the different way to do it. I'm going to show you just this one simpler method because it's backwards compatible with older versions of PHP. Not that old, but old enough. So I'm going to show you this. Making the leap from this method to the MySQL I is not that hard. So just want you to be aware of that. Okay, now, we assume that things are good now. So I put out a heading, authors who live in California, and I begin a table. Formatting SQL results in a table is usually a good idea. In fact, we've already done that with a file before when we had to limit a file with delimited strings. So we're sort of replacing that and doing it this way. Now here's another MySQL function. MySQL num rows. I'm getting the number of rows that came back from the result object. How many rows are in that grid? We can use that down here in a for statement to know how many times we have to loop through the information in this internal grid that's stored in this $result area. And so we want to go through essentially one row in the grid at a time. So I start with 0, go through I until it's num results, and bump it up. It's a standard for loop. We've seen this a number of times. You recall this little method here where I use the modulus to find out when we have an alternate row, so we get different background colors. I've done this in a number of examples, so I just left it here. Makes it easier to read. Here's the next key statement. MySQL fetch array. There are other statements, but this is a good one. And it goes against the result, and it basically takes one row off the top of the result. If we have a grid like a spreadsheet, it takes the first row the first time it's issued and sticks that row in a $row variable. Now, don't be fooled by the simple name. This $row is an array of information. It's actually, let's go back up to the statement, it's this array. It has last name, first name, and state in it. Whatever we selected in the select list, it's going to be an array that holds element 0, element 1, element 2. If I select 20 columns, all 20 columns will be coming back in that $row array. Now, we're used to selecting from an array by looking at a number like 0, 1, 2. But this is an associative array, which means we can use a word to go retrieve the value. That word, of course, has to be unique. It's a key word. So what is used is the column name. This string has to be equal to the column name for the last name column. And when we pass that to the row array, it will return the value that got returned from that column on that row. So I see the last name, first name, and state. It's pretty straightforward. It's almost monkey see, monkey do. You can just go through this and put the column names in here, pull them into a variable of the same name, basically, as the column name, and off you go. Now, here in the output display area that I was building the table in, now I'm ready to write the cells of information. In fact, up here I wrote the beginning TR with the different background colors. So I can write the last name, first name, state, and then I end the row. When we're done with this loop, this is the thing that ends the loop, I have to remember to put the output table tag in there. And we go all the way down, and just at the very end, the last thing I do is I put out a totaling. The number of rows in the results was my row count. Now that was a row count up here that I was maintaining within the for loop. We put that in output display, then print it, and it all works beautifully. We'll go back to the output just for a moment. That's the PHP MyAdmin. Here's the output to the statement, and here you see it. Let's run this one more time. We have the number of rows and the results is 15, and we see all the results. All right, that ends this presentation on connecting to the database, to MySQL, and then to your particular database and doing a select statement.